Hello, I'm Stuart Tom, and on behalf of the ICC, CALBO, and the California Fire Chiefs Association, I'd like to welcome you to highlighted changes to the 2016 California codes. Today we're going to be talking about some of the changes that we can anticipate in the codes that we are all adopting and will be taking effect starting January 1st, 2017. So, changes to model codes and California statutory requirements occur on a regular basis. Changes to model codes through the ICC, IATMO, and NFPA processes establish the foundation for the rules that govern how buildings and structures shall be constructed, used, occupied, and maintained. State amendments to those model codes result in the formulation of the California Building Standards Code, or Title 24, of the California Code of Regulations. And each code development cycle results in numerous changes which may have varying effects on the way we all do our jobs. Every triennial California code cycle is typically preceded by one or more comprehensive classes addressing significant changes. They're often presented by CALBO, ICC chapters, and various city and county jurisdictions. They tend to cover a really broad range of topics, including code changes which may not have an impact on your jurisdiction. Typically, these classes will be available later on this year, starting in November, sometime around that point. And they generally require attendance at a full or half-day seminar, thereby taking staff away from their primary plan check or inspection duties. So, is there a quicker way to focus on the upcoming code changes that are most likely to affect you? It's actually why we're here today. The following changes to either the model codes or California codes have been selected because they are likely to affect most designers, builders, and code officials here in California. However, after publication of the codes, further exploration of the 2016 California codes is surely encouraged to identify other changes that may also affect specific projects. There will be several comprehensive significant changes resources that have been developed by noted experts, and they will be available for those who would like a broader exposure to the changes we can expect in 2016. Let me talk about them very briefly. First, the significant changes to the California Building Code. This is a fantastic resource. Paul Armstrong, Doug Thornburg, John Henry, and Jay Woodward, as we all know, are very, very familiar at developing these significant changes resources. And as they have in the past, they've done another outstanding job in developing this significant changes resource. So for those of you that will be interested in a broader exposure to the changes to the California Code, I will encourage you to take a look at this resource when it is available. Similarly, significant changes to the California Residential Code, another resource that will soon be available. Both Paul Armstrong and Stephen Van Note have teamed up to develop this resource, and just as in past years, it's an outstanding resource that will cover all of the changes for even those jurisdictions that do deal with some of the less frequently encountered changes to the code. Great resource, and I'll be talking about that later. And then finally, for those of you that deal in the fire prevention world, Kevin Reinertson, Fulton Cochran, and Kevin Scott have partnered up to develop the significant changes to the California Fire Code. Just like the significant changes to the Building Code and Residential Code, these authors have done a fantastic job in taking a look at our California Fire Code as it exists today, and have identified the significant changes that we will be encountering with the 2016 version of the California Fire Code, and this is also a fantastic resource. I encourage you to take a look at all three of these, especially for those jurisdictions that have a broad range of buildings, uses, and occupancies within your jurisdiction. So, let's go ahead and get started in these selected changes that I want to talk about today. Definitions. Chapter 2 has a new definition of platform. This is a new definition that clearly has a distinction that does not require compliance with other features that would otherwise be required for a stage. This is useful because without this definition, designers and code enforcement officials would sometimes encounter plans and it would identify a stage, and the question would come up, do I have to have all of those features that are typically required for a stage? The separation between the assembly occupancy area and the backstage area, do I need a proscenium curtain with all that fire-resistant construction and so forth? There was clearly a need in the code, and the model code has responded with a new definition. So platform is now defined as a raised area within a building used for worship, the presentation of music, plays, or other entertainment, the head table for special guests, the raised area for lecturers and speakers, boxing and wrestling rings, theater in the round stages, and similar purposes wherein, other than horizontal sliding curtains, there are no overhead hanging curtains, drops, scenery, or stage effects other than lighting and sound. And of course, if it's being used on a temporary basis, a temporary platform is one installed for not more than 30 days. So this new definition of a platform may be useful when you encounter these sorts of things in your projects. Another change I'd like to talk about, commercial kitchens. For our new code, a new classification for food processing establishments and commercial kitchens that are not associated with a restaurant. Section 304.1 and 306.2 deal with this, and basically what we see is that if that cooking area is less than 2,500 square feet, they may be classified as a Group B occupancy. If larger than 2,500 square feet, they do need to be classified as an F1 occupancy. And regardless of size, commercial kitchens that are associated with restaurants are classified as a Group A2 occupancy. So getting back to the main definition here, this new classification for food processing establishments or commercial kitchens, if they're not associated with a restaurant, that could be something like your walk-in, takeout, pizza type places where there is no restaurant where people sit down and eat, but it is clearly a food processing facility. If it's less than 2,500 square feet, it would be a Group B occupancy. Wouldn't have to classify it as an A2. Accessory storage spaces has changed slightly, and you need to be aware of this particular change. Section 311.1.1. The change to accessory storage spaces basically requires now that in addition to that accessory space having an aggregate area limitation of 10% of the floor area, now those individual storage spaces are limited to a maximum of 100 square feet if they're going to be considered accessory to the main use. If the individual storage space is larger than 100 square feet, it should be classified as a Group S occupancy. Presuming that the type of hazard exposure is rather low, it would probably be a Group S2 occupancy. But the significance of this is that in a lot of areas, especially some large areas, there previously might be a storage area which, while it would be less than 10% of the area of the main use, it might still be over 100 square feet. 311.1.1 now has this limitation that the aggregate area, the individual area, has to have a maximum of 100 square feet. So make sure that when you're taking a look at these new accessory storage areas, you measure those and assign the occupancy accordingly. Egress through an atrium has changed. Egress through an atrium is now limited slightly on upper floors, that is, floors above the level of exit discharge. If you want details on it, take a look at section 404.9. But in effect, the change now indicates that on levels other than that level of exit discharge, the maximum exit access travel distance is limited to 200 feet, regardless of whether or not the building is fully sprinklered. We're all familiar with exit access travel distances, and you know that in Chapter 10, exit access travel distance is allowed to be extended based on occupancy and whether or not the building is provided with an automatic sprinkler system. This new provision indicates that if this exit access travel distance is occurring within an atrium environment, if it's on a level other than the level of exit discharge, that sprinkler exit access distance increase would not be allowed on those levels. You still need to make sure that the exit access travel distance above the level of exit discharge is limited to 200 feet. So in your typical atrium type hotel, or if you have an office building with a large atrium space, if exit access on upper floors is occurring through those upper levels, even in fully sprinklered buildings, make sure that they get to that protected exit enclosure within 200 feet. Now on the level of exit discharge down below, exit access travel distance extensions are still allowed for fully sprinklered buildings. And so therefore, depending on table 1017.2, depending on which occupancy you have, that may be extended to either 250 feet, 300 feet, or 400 feet as appropriate for the occupancy. But that would be on the level of exit discharge only. Exit through an atrium has another change, and this is very significant. Termination of the interior exit stairways has been clarified to prevent merging of separate stairs into a common atrium space. Section 404.10 has now been modified to have the provision that no more than 50% of interior exit stairs may terminate into an atrium at the level of exit discharge. The remainder of interior exit stairs must maintain separation from the atrium environment. So let's take a look at a diagram and see what this means. The intent is to see to it that we don't have all of the required interior exit stairways merging into a common atrium environment at the level of exit discharge, because if that were to occur, if the atrium space was compromised by fire, smoke, or some other situation, all the exits could conceivably be blocked. So this particular section now would allow this exit here on the left to discharge into the atrium space, but an interior exit stairway over here would have to exit independent of the atrium. And this will guarantee that all of the exits don't merge through an atrium. Explosives and fireworks has been addressed by the CBC through the elimination of previous section 434 that relates to explosives. Basically what's happened is CBC section 434 has been replaced by a reference to the California Fire Code, Chapter 56. While most jurisdictions don't encounter this very often, it is somewhat important to keep this in mind because of the need for jurisdictional awareness of sporting goods and other Group M occupancy retail facilities that might be dealing with large quantities of ammunition, smokeless powder, and other supplies that are often used for reloading ammunition. There are some rather severe quantity limits on that, and if you do have these types of occupancies, and we're expecting to find those provisions in section 434, they have been eliminated from the California Fire Code, and there is now a pointer to the Fire Code, Chapter 56. I would like to remind everybody that while Group M occupancies are not normally regulated by local fire authorities, that if you do have situations where large quantities of these materials are being utilized in some of your specialty sporting facilities, definitely engage your fire department or your fire prevention bureau. Let's take a look. So, if you take a look at Chapter 56 of the California Fire Code, for which there's now a pointer, you will see that there are new standards here, and basically what it comes down to is there are some exceptions, and right here in item number 4, it deals with some of the quantities that you need to pay attention to. Once again, if you do encounter some of these occupancies within your jurisdiction and you were expecting to find these provisions in Section 434 of the Building Code, not there anymore, engage the assistance of your fire prevention staff and turn to Chapter 56. Height and area has been adjusted slightly, and I think it's been done in a manner which helps simplify things. The allowable height and area provisions have been reformatted in tables 504.3 for height, 504.4 for stories, and 506.2 for area, which now includes benefits for automatic fire sprinklers. In our current version of the California Building Code, all of these are contained within Table 503 and a series of equations which allows the user to determine what the allowable areas, heights in story, and absolute height in feet are. It's been reformatted in our new code to break out Table 503 into 3 separate tables. The California Building Code has further modified these tables by adding rows to distinguish whether the automatic sprinklers are being utilized to derive an area increase or a height increase, thereby maintaining California's higher level of protection, which is sometimes referred to as double dip protection. So let's take a look. This is a portion of Table 504.3, and you'll see that this table provides information regarding the allowable building height in feet as measured above grade plane. The column on the left identifies the occupancy classification, and then the rest of the table off to the right will identify what that allowable tabular height is in feet above grade plane based on type of construction. You will see that this second column here has a bunch of codes, and S, and so forth. And what these represent is if a particular occupancy is provided with sprinklers, if it's non-sprinklered, or in some instances, if it is sprinklered without taking an area increase, or if it is sprinklered and utilizing an area increase, you would use the corresponding information off to the right of the table. So this is how, in Table 504.3, the new code is integrating sprinkler information into the table itself. And as I mentioned, for certain occupancies that are regulated by the State Fire Marshal's Office, the table has been amended to address whether or not those sprinklers are also being used for an area increase. Okay. If we move on to Table 504.4, this table identifies the number of allowable stories that would be allowed for a particular occupancy classification based on the type of construction. Just as we saw in the previous table, the determination on the number of stories is also affected by whether or not that building is provided with sprinklers, whether it's a non-sprinklered building, and then here in California, for certain occupancies, whether or not those sprinklers are also being used to derive an area increase, or if those sprinklers are not being used to derive an area increase. So as an example, since Group A occupancies are regulated through the State Fire Marshal's Office, if there was a Group A2 occupancy and the building was sprinklered, but the sprinklers were not being used for an area increase, the middle row right here for the A2 occupancy would be utilized to determine how many stories, because this would indicate that the building is sprinklered without utilizing an area increase. If that same building with a Group A2 occupancy was fully sprinklered, but they were utilizing an area increase, the bottom row would be utilized right here to determine how many stories would be allowed. And what you'll see is, moving over to the right of the table, if an area increase is also used to avoid that double dip benefit, the number of stories would be reduced by 1. And the third table that we'll see in the new code, is Table 506.2. This table identifies the allowable tabular area for a building based on occupancy and based on type of construction. And like the other two tables, there is a column which identifies whether or not the building is sprinklered, whether it's non-sprinklered, whether or not the sprinklers are being utilized to derive a height increase, or whether or not it is not being utilized to derive a height increase. And the table works the same way. Identify the occupancy in the left column, determine how the sprinklers are being used, if sprinklers are indeed present within the building, find the type of construction, and this will give you the basic tabular allowable area, which would be plugged into some equations, as we will soon see. So, these are the new equations that we can see in the code. The model codes have modified Section 506, and there is a new equation that will help you determine the allowable area. And as we see, the new equation for single occupancy, one-story buildings, as prescribed under Section 506.2.1, is the allowable area equals the tabular area from that previous table that we just saw, plus the non-sprinklered value of that area times a frontage increase. So let me explain how this equation is to be interpreted. This first component here, tabular area, is the area that we determine from the previous table depending on whether or not the building is sprinklered. So let's go back one table. As you can see in table 506.2, if a building is indeed being used or does indeed have sprinklers, the tabular allowable area that we would derive from this table could be a fairly large number. So if we were to use the example of a group A2 building, and there were sprinklers, and they were not utilizing a height increase, it would be this middle row here. And let's say that the building was type 3A construction, a group A2 with sprinklers without using a height increase for type 3A construction would have a tabular value of 42,000 square feet to start with. But what I also want you to do is I want you to take a look at this value right here for a non-sprinklered building, 14,000 square feet. Because if we go ahead one slide and plug it into the equation, what we see is the tabular value utilizing sprinklers would be utilized for this parameter right here, A sub t. And then what we would do is we would add the non-sprinklered area value multiplied by any applicable frontage increase factor. And that's how you will now determine what the allowable area is for a single story, single occupancy building. Now, if we have a multi-story building, we basically take the same approach, starting with that tabular area, including whether or not it may be increased because the building is sprinklered or not. We add the non-sprinklered allowable area multiplied by any frontage increase that they might be entitled to, and we multiply that times a story factor. Now, the story factor is the actual number of stories of a multi-story building, up to a limit of 3. With the exception that in California, for A, E, H, I, L, and R occupancies and high-rise buildings, the story factor is limited to 2. So if I had an occupancy other than an A, E, H, I, L, or R, and it was 4 stories, I would get to multiply this component right here, NS, times the frontage increase factor, by 3, because while it's a 4-story building, the story factor would be limited to 3. If that was an A, E, H, I, L, or R occupancy building, my story factor would be limited to 2. So in effect, the height and area has been simplified in California by breaking the previous table 503 into 3 separate tables, but the ultimate area, number of stories, and absolute height in feet is essentially the same as what we've had before. It's just another method of doing it, and it simplifies it slightly. Separation of incidental uses. Fire resistance rated separation between the main and incidental uses has been reformatted slightly in Table 509. The concept is still the same. Certain spaces within buildings, due to what occurs within those buildings, may expose adjoining areas to certain levels of risk and do have to be separated in a certain fashion. And Table 509 does identify how those incidental uses shall be treated. Most of the changes affect only Group I2 and I2.1 occupancies, and the level of protection in incidental use areas, whether it is through fire-resistive construction or sprinklers or a combination of fire-resistive construction and sprinklers for the other occupancies, is essentially the same. But for Group I2 and I2.1, it has changed slightly. So the separation of incidental uses in other than non-ambulatory care facilities serving more than 5 persons and patients is essentially what we're accustomed to in the 2013 CBC. This is what Table 509 now looks like, and if you take a look at the middle of the table, this is where we start to see areas that deal with Group I2 laundry rooms, Group I3 jail cell facilities, Group I2 physical and plant maintenance shops, and so forth. And this is where it's been clarified slightly. In the upper and lower portions of Table 509, it's virtually identical to what we've had for incidental uses in the current code. Podium construction has now changed. There are some significant changes to podium construction, and for those jurisdictions that do have this type of construction, and we're seeing a lot of it throughout California, those changes are actually very, very welcome because it simplifies and facilitates some of the trends and methods of construction that we've been seeing for the past couple of years. The first change that I'd like to talk about is rather significant, and it's a revision that allows multiple stories allowed below that 3-hour occupancy assembly. Under our current code, the 2013 CBC, the first level above grade plane up to the podium is actually limited to only 1 story in height. And so therefore, a trend to try to get multi-story occupancies below that podium has actually run into a problem with the code. The code now has a provision which will allow multi-story construction below that podium. So some of the things that you may be seeing in your jurisdiction are now going to be allowed by right through the code. Furthermore, any occupancy other than Group H is now allowed in that Type 1 portion of the building located below the 3-hour occupancy separation. So let's take a look. If we take a look at the picture on the left, this is what we're accustomed to. As you can see down at street level, we're accustomed to these podium-type buildings with a single-story limitation for the Type 1 portion located below that 3-hour fire resistance rated separation. That's been eliminated now. What we get now is if you take a look at the image on the lower right, if we have the podium at this level right here, you will see that you can have multiple stories below that podium. And what that does for us is it allows the current trend of having multi-story establishments below that Some designers like to have multi-story restaurants and other facilities down at the street level, retail level, and the code will now allow that. And then, of course, new construction up above. Generally, we see either Type 5 or Type 3 construction up above. The code still allows for that. The absolute height of the building, I would like to remind everybody, for this upper portion is still measured all the way down to grade plane, while the number of stories, of course, is measured from the top of the podium deck. Fire sprinkler substitution, change here doesn't affect too much construction here in California, but it is a change that I want to bring everybody's attention to, and that is an elimination of automatic fire sprinkler substitution for 1-hour construction. Currently, Table 601 has a footnote, it's footnote D, which if you were to open up the current code, it would indicate that if you have a building and it is provided with an automatic sprinkler system, and those sprinklers are not being utilized for some other requirement under the code, the mere fact that that building is provided with sprinklers would allow those sprinklers to substitute for 1-hour construction. This footnote has been eliminated, so 1-hour sprinkler substitution is no longer allowed in the code. For the most part, that's not a big deal in California, and the reason for that is those sprinklers are generally being used for some other benefit, whether it's for an area increase, a story height increase, an increase in the overall height of the building. Those sprinklers typically are being used for some other purpose, in which case that footnote wouldn't have any applicability, but it has been eliminated nonetheless. Table 602 has been expanded to now include a column to identify dimensional equivalencies for structural composite lumber. Cross-laminated timber is now expressly allowed as well for Type 5 construction. There is no column in the table because for cross-laminated timber, the prescribed heavy timber sizes must be matched by the actual CLT dimensions. And of course, solid sawn lumber and glued laminated lumber dimensions remain unchanged. So let's take a look at that table. Table 602.4 has been expanded. Off to the right, you now see minimum structural composite lumber net sizes. So whereas the table previously only had heavy timber dimensions for solid sawn lumber and for glued laminated lumber, if you have SCL lumber, you will find the dimensions there. And as I previously mentioned, cross-laminated timber is allowed for Type 4 construction. You just have to use the actual sizes. So as an example, if you have a load-bearing column in heavy timber construction for Type 4, the minimum dimensions would be 8 by 8 for a load-bearing column. If it is a solid sawn member, you would use an 8 by 8. And the dressed finished size of that lumber is slightly smaller than that, and that would be permissible. If you were to be providing a column in Type 4 construction and that load-bearing column was a glued laminated member, the width would have to be at least 6 3/4 inches by a depth of 8 1/4. If it was structural composite lumber, the minimum width would be 7 inches, minimum depth would be 7 1/2 inches, and of course with CLT, a load-bearing column would have to have actual dimensions of 8 inches by 8 inches. Projections have been modified in the building code. Table 705.2 has changed. It actually has, in some instances, a rather significant effect on allowable projections. And basically what occurs is that projections from exterior walls of buildings are required to observe a greater fire separation distance when exterior walls are located more than 3 feet from a property line. To take a look at exactly what effect this is, we can compare Table 705.2 from our current 2013 CBC to the new Table 705.2 that we will see in the 2016 CBC. And as you can see in comparing these two tables, that in the current 2013 CBC, the fire separation distance between 2 and 5 feet would allow for a minimum separation of that projection of 24 inches to a property line or whatever reference is being used to measure that fire separation distance. Instead of going from 2 to 5 feet, that's changed. In the 2016 CBC, if we take a look at the new table off to the right, what we see is that when you have a fire separation distance greater than 2 feet but up to 3 feet, that distance between your property line and the edge of that projection is still 24 inches, but then at 3 feet, it all starts to change. From 3 feet to less than 30 feet, you start at 24 inches, but then you add 8 additional inches for every foot of required fire separation distance beyond 3 feet or fraction thereof. And then at 30 feet or greater, so that would generally be type 1 construction, your projections have to be 20 feet from that property line or from whatever reference you're using to measure fire separation distance. So this can have a very, very significant effect on where projections can be. And so you can take a look at table 705.2. Let's take a look at a diagram. This is basically what we're talking about. The exterior wall of a building is where the fire separation distance is measured, but the distance that that projection has to be measured from is from the edge of that projection to either the property line or whatever line is being used to measure the fire separation distance. And no projections are ever allowed within 2 feet. So what we're going to see in the 2016 CBC is that projections from buildings are likely to be pushed back further from property lines than they're allowed right now. Smoke and heat vents and mechanical smoke removal. The change that we're talking about here is actually a model code change in IBC Section 910.1 through 910.4.7. And what it does is the IBC now matches what we currently have in the 2013 CBC. So in a sense, the IBC has caught up with a provision that we have in the CBC. So this won't have a change to those of us that have been enforcing the CBC this past cycle, but for those that deal with the IBC, including designers and architects that do work outside of the state of California, 910.1 through 910.4.7 has changed, and it affects Group S and Group S occupancies the most, and we will see why with the next slide. It affects those occupancies most because 910.2.1 requires the group F1 and S1 occupancies having more than 50 square feet do have to be provided with some type of smoke removal device, whether that is an automatic smoke and heat vent or if it is a mechanical smoke exhaust. Really depends on whether or not the building is one story or multi-story and whether or not you have access to put a smoke hatch or a heat vent on the roof. As I mentioned, there really is no significant change for those of us in California because our past code did have these provisions. But if we take a look at what those provisions are, just in summary, off to the lower left, we can see what those requirements are. When you do put a smoke vent or heat vent in a building, it should be at least 20 feet from either a property line or a firewall within that building if a firewall is used to split the building into separate areas. Should be located at least 10 feet from fire barriers. They should be uniformly located throughout the space to effectively remove smoke and heat. And in order to determine the aggregate area of vents, to determine how many vents we have, that area is determined by dividing the volume of the building, so that would be the floor area multiplied by the ceiling height, by 9,000 if the building is provided with an automatic sprinkler system. And if the area is not provided with an automatic fire sprinkler system, then the total aggregate area of vents is determined by simply taking the floor area of that space and dividing it by 50. Large family daycare homes has seen a slight change here in California. It's really more of a clarification to make sure that things are done right. Basically what has occurred is language has been changed to now clarify the requirement for a manual device in large family daycare homes that shall actuate a fire alarm signal, which shall be audible throughout the facility. It was previously deemed to be a little bit too vague. What constituted a manual device? And what does actuation of a fire alarm signal really mean? Well, the 2013 CBC language has now been changed and slightly clarified, and at the bottom of this slide we now see what 907.2.6.4 will say. Large family daycare. Every large family daycare home shall be provided with at least one manual fire alarm box at a location approved by the authority having jurisdiction. Such device shall actuate a fire alarm signal, which shall be audible throughout the facility at a minimum level of 15 dB above ambient noise level. These devices need not be interconnected to any other fire alarm device, have a control panel, or be electrically supervised or provided with emergency power. But here's the important part. Such device or devices shall be attached to the structure and must be a device that is listed and approved by the Office of the State Fire Marshal. This is the language which has now been added. The reason that the device being attached to the structure and being listed by the State Fire Marshal's office is important is that if you were to take a look at the previous language, there's nothing that said that you actually had to have a fire alarm box permanently affixed to a building. There were some people that were managing these large family daycare homes that felt that if they had that little fob in their pocket that could set off the alarm system in their building, that would be sufficient. Of course, part of the problem there is if they set it down, they forget where they put it, and a problem occurs, they don't know where it is to actuate that alarm, thereby initiating a signal. But if there is a device and it's attached to the structure, it will be in a location that they're familiar with, and they can set off that alarm. Carbon monoxide requirements have changed significantly, and you need to be aware of this. Section 915 has been added to the IBC, which now establishes extensive requirements for carbon monoxide detection. Previously, in California, we had Section 420.6. That has now been eliminated because the new Section 915, which was added to the IBC, now has all of the provisions that we need. Basically, what we're looking at is residential carbon monoxide detection provisions in buildings containing covered multifamily dwellings as defined in Chapter 2. All required carbon monoxide alarms also need to be equipped with the capability to provide visible alarm notification. So this is linking back to what ends up happening for audibly impaired individuals, whether it's a strobe or some other feature. 915.7 will be addressing that. There are also new provisions for carbon monoxide detection for Group E and Group I occupancies. We didn't have that before, but now in Section 915.1.1, there is a provision, so if you have a Group E and a Group I occupancy, now you might need to add carbon monoxide detection. And part of that includes the following. For Group E classrooms with occupant loads greater than 30, carbon monoxide signals shall be automatically transmitted to an on-site location that is staffed by school personnel. That's new Section 915.2.3. So in summary, what we get is Section 915 has been added to the code that has all of the provisions that we're familiar with for carbon monoxide detection in residential buildings, and it now adds these provisions for Group E and Group I occupancy buildings as well. And it does remind us that if we do have covered facilities, that we do have to have the capability to support a visible alarm. Let's talk about location of smoke alarms. Smoke alarm location standards of NFPA 72 related to the proximity of fixed cooking appliances and bathtubs and showers has been added to IBC Section 907.2.11.3. Previously, what we had were certain portions of NFPA 72 were reprinted in the CBC for reference, and they essentially included these provisions. That reprint of NFPA 72 has been eliminated, and IBC Section 907.2.11.3 has all of those provisions for us. For those building inspectors that go out and inspect buildings and they're trying to determine whether or not a smoke alarm is located in the correct location based on the type of alarm, 907.2.11.3 is going to have those parameters. In summary, what we're looking at is if that smoke alarm is an ionization-based smoke alarm, it should be located at least 20 feet horizontally from permanently installed cooking appliances. However, if it's an ionization-based alarm and it has a silencing switch, that smoke alarm can be located within or at least 10 feet horizontally from a permanently installed cooking appliance. So it can be located about half as far away, just by virtue of the fact that it has a silencing switch. If it is a photoelectric type smoke alarm, then it has to be located at least 6 feet horizontally from a permanently installed cooking appliance. So depending on the configuration of a space and where cooking appliances are, if there is not sufficient room to place a smoke alarm at least 20 feet away, whether it is equipped with a silencing switch or whether or not a photoelectric type smoke alarm is installed, they can be located closer. And then regardless of whether or not it is an ionization-based alarm or a photoelectric alarm, they should be located at least 3 feet horizontally from any door or opening that leads to a bathroom that contains a tub or shower. And that's to prevent a false detection due to steam. So let's take a look at a diagram. I put this diagram together to put all of these requirements visually into one image. And basically what we're looking for over here on the left, if you do have a fixed, permanently installed cooking appliance, the smoke alarm should be located either 20 feet away if it's an ionization-based alarm, or if it is an ionization-based alarm with a silencing switch, it can be located 10 feet away. And if it's photoelectric, it only needs to be separated 6 feet away. And it should be located at least 3 feet from a door to a bathroom that has either a bathtub or a shower. Some folks have taken this picture, punched holes, and thrown it right in their code book because visually this is an easy way to sum up what those requirements are. A new change to the code has been incorporated to address assembly occupancies on the roof of a building. 903.2.1.6 has been added to the code, which now requires that where an occupied roof has an assembly occupancy with an occupant load exceeding 100 persons for a Group A2 occupancy, and if it exceeds 300 persons for any other Group A occupancy, all the floors between that occupied roof and the level of exit discharge has to be equipped with a fire sprinkler system in accordance with 903.3.1.1 or 903.3.1.2. There's an exception to that. Open parking garages of either Type 1 or Type 2 construction may still have an assembly on top of that open parking garage, and you don't have to sprinkler those spaces down below unless it's required by some other portion of the code. This is important because if you do have an existing building that is currently not sprinklered and you want to introduce some type of Group A2 occupancy, say a restaurant, rooftop dining on top of that building, it might trigger sprinklers on floors down below. Chapter 10 has been rearranged and some provisions have been merged together. Most egress provisions do remain essentially the same, but there are some interesting changes that I want to bring to your attention. Some of those important changes affect delayed egress, two-way communication, locks on main exits, and we'll talk about some others as well. First, let's talk about the delayed egress. Delayed egress signage requirements have been revised that now requires specific language to advise whether the door must be pushed or pulled once the latching mechanism releases. Section 1010.1.9.7 has the language which must be included, and there is also a reminder in that section which indicates that the signage is required to be in tactile braille to comply with Chapter 11B. So let's take a look at the next slide and we'll see what this new signage requirement is. The code now indicates that for doors that swing in the direction of egress, the sign shall read, "Push until alarm sounds. Door can be opened in 15 seconds." Now, if that door swings in the opposite direction, the code now requires that for doors that swing toward the person leaving the room, the sign needs to read, "Pull until alarm sounds. Door can be opened in 15 seconds." While most doors do swing in the direction of egress travel based on occupancy and occupant load, there certainly are some instances where an egress door, would be allowed to swing toward the person leaving the room. This new signage is important because by virtue of the fact that the latch does not release until after it's been pushed for quite a while, you can imagine that if that door needs to swing towards you and a person is pushing and pushing and pushing, after 15 seconds, that person might think that the latch has not released because they're pushing when the door should be pulled toward them. And that's why the code has changed, thereby requiring this language. So the current delayed egress signage is shown on the left, and the sign would say, "Keep pushing, this door will open in 15 seconds. And in the case of this door, where the door certainly does swing in the direction of egress travel, there would not be a problem. But if this door were to swing in the opposite direction toward the person leaving the room, this is where the new signage would be important. Two-way communication requirements have changed. This is actually an exception that expressly eliminates the need for two-way communication at elevator landings which only serve freight and service elevators or private residential elevators. This actually is a change to model code language in the IBC that will resolve common errors that have been made by many jurisdictions in the past. 1009.8 is a section which clearly does not allow or does not require this two-way communication in those instances. And right now, under the code, this exemption does not exist. So one could certainly argue that if there was an elevator that wasn't used by the general public, it was, say, a service or a freight elevator, if it was on an accessible level, a strict reading of the code would require two-way communication. Of course, that's not the intent of the code. The intent of the code is that on an accessible level, an individual that might need access to two-way communication if they were seeking refuge, waiting to be rescued, would have access to that communication. And so for that reason, 1009.8 has been revised and has eliminated that. So that will reduce some errors that have occurred in the past. Locking hardware. Signage for locks on main exits has been revised. 1010.1.9. The recommended language for the 1-inch tall lettering above main exits has been changed. And while the change is subtle, it actually helps clarify certain things that I'll get into. What the code now says is that doors shall remain unlocked when the space is occupied rather than when the building is occupied. In fact, if you were to take a look at 1010.1.9, you'll find in that section that the recommended language states, this door to remain unlocked when this space is occupied. Under our current code, the recommended language is this door to remain unlocked when the building is occupied. Part of the reason that this clarification is useful is that some jurisdictions have actually interpreted the recommended language of the notification above the door to indicate that only the main entry door to a building would be allowed to be locked to have a certain type of lock or latch as long as it is unlocked when the building is occupied. The new language makes it clear that the intent is that certain latching hardware would be allowed as long as that door remains unlocked while that individual space is occupied. So off to the left, we see the typical signage as it exists today over a door, this door to remain unlocked when the building is occupied. And of course, if we had an individual office space, an individual retail space that might be served by a common lobby or within a larger building, the locking and latching hardware that would be allowed for would be the same as long as that door does remain unlocked while the space is occupied. It is the main door or doors of that space. And that space is either a group A having an occupant load of 300 or less, it's a group B, F, M, or S occupancy, or a place of religious worship. That's where that locking and latching hardware would be allowed as long as this signage is provided. Egress through elevator lobbies has been clarified slightly. Section 1016.2 has been modified slightly, and basically what happens is elevator lobbies may be considered as an intervening space or an intervening room for egress purposes. So as long as that elevator lobby complies with all of the provisions that we're accustomed to for any other intervening room that an individual is allowed to pass through as part of their exit access, it would be allowed. Now previously, a corridor would be allowed to pass through an elevator lobby only if the building was fully sprinklered and if a secondary means of egress was available without passing through that elevator lobby. Now, by thinking of it as an intervening space or room, it makes it a little bit easier to determine whether or not passage through that space and past an elevator opening would be allowed. I would like to draw your attention to the fact that here in California, the California Building Code has modified this provision slightly by not allowing elevator lobbies to be treated as that intervening space or room in group I2 or I2.1 occupancies. But in other occupancies, it would apply. For group F1 and S1 occupancies, for those jurisdictions that have very, very large manufacturing and storage spaces, exit access travel distance has changed. We're accustomed to this in California because we do have a provision which does allow exit access travel distance to be increased to 400 feet for F1 and F2 occupancies, and the model I code has now caught up to our provision here in the California Building Code. So still for the next cycle as well, if your jurisdiction does have very, very large manufacturing or storage occupancies that would fall into the F1 or S1 category if they're fully sprinklered, rather than the shorter exit access travel distance, they are allowed to go all the way up to 400 feet. For exit passageways, the fire barrier separation between an interior exit stair and the exit passageway extension all the way to the exterior of a building is no longer required as long as there are no other openings into that exit passageway. As we all know, an exit passageway is not allowed to have any openings into it other than required exits from occupied space. That is still the case, and an interior exit stairway which terminates at the level of exit discharge within the building must still have that exit passageway extension to the exterior of the building. If that exit passageway also has other openings that are required exits from occupied space into that passageway, a fire barrier is required to isolate that interior exit stairway from the rest of that passageway. But if that exit passageway doesn't have any other openings between that interior exit stairway and the exterior of the building, the separation provided by that fire barrier is not required. You can just eliminate it. This is a big change here in California and actually throughout the country, Chapter 34 of the Building Code has been eliminated. So therefore, provisions for existing construction have been moved. And here in California, Part 10 of Title 24 now adopts portions of the International Existing Buildings Code. Specifically, Chapter 4 establishes the prescriptive method, which is pretty similar to what we're accustomed to in the existing Chapter 34 provisions of the IBC. Utilization of the area method, for those that are familiar with Level 1, Level 2, and Level 3 alterations, and also utilization of the performance compliance method have not been adopted outright in California. Future versions of the California Building Code, perhaps the next adoption cycle, may consider it. But for now, for the 2016 California Building Code, we are adopting up through Chapter 4. And we won't have to worry about the area method or the performance compliance methods just yet. I would like to remind those jurisdictions that do have provisions within their code related to existing construction, if you do have local amendments, that any amendments that you have that relate to existing Chapter 34 provisions, you will need to adjust those so that they pertain to the new Part 10 of Title 24, the California Existing Buildings Code. For Chapter 7A, Wildland Urban Interface, Chapter 7A has been updated to recognize a couple of ASTM standards. In particular, ASTM E2886 has been integrated into Chapter 7A for attic vent acceptance. So for those jurisdictions, especially those in the foothills throughout the state of California that do have extensive wildland urban interface or WUI areas, rather than going to the state's website to find a list of acceptable attic vents, any attic vent that has been tested and certified to be compliant with ASTM E2886 will now be acceptable. Those products should be clearly identified and have all the proper markings and certifications that they are compliant. Please be aware of the fact that the listing of acceptable vents on the OSFM website has already been removed. So Section 706A in the Building Code and also Section R337.6 in the California Residential Code now will refer to ASTM E2886. There's another ASTM standard I'd like to draw your attention to, and that is ASTM E2957. This is recognized for evaluation of the resistance of wildfire penetration of eaves, soffits, and other projections when enclosing that construction within 1 hour construction is undesirable. Of course, for projects that are located in the very high fire hazard severity zones, certain aspects of the building are not only required to be constructed of ignition resistant material, but in particular eaves, soffits, and anything that projects from a building was previously required to be constructed in a certain manner. ASTM E2957 now simplifies this. If somebody wants to utilize a particular type of construction rather than boxing it in stucco or some other recognized method of construction, ASTM E2957 would confirm that that method of construction is acceptable. Moving on to the residential code. In the California Residential Code, a number of sections have been modified that affect solar PV conduits. Specific provisions regarding placement of those electrical conduits on the roof have been integrated into the California Code, basically requiring that they be located as close as possible to a ridge, hip, or valley, as well as utilizing the shortest conduit runs practical. The intent of these modifications to the California codes was to minimize the amount of conduit to reduce tripping hazards on the roof in the event firefighters would have to gain access to the roof during a fire to vent heat and smoke. Of course, the industry tends to self-regulate because businesses that do not pay very much attention to where they place conduits probably will not get favorable recommendations for the next job, and therefore they tend to utilize as little conduit on the roof as possible. So the industry does a pretty good job, but if you were interested, those are the sections which clearly require it to be as close to ridges, hips, and valleys as possible. Accessory structures have been modified in the CRC, and things have relaxed slightly. Structures that are accessory and incidental to a dwelling may be considered as accessory structures without the current 3,000 square foot and 2-story maximum express limitations. So if you were to take a look at R202 of the California Residential Code, what you'll notice is that there's an emphasis placed on the fact that that use of the structure is accessory to and incidental to the main dwelling. As long as that is the case, it can now be larger than 3,000 square feet. It can actually be more than 2 stories in height, as long as it is truly accessory and incidental to that main dwelling. Just as we saw in the building code, projections in the residential code have been modified slightly through a clarification. In effect, the limitation or protection of projections in the residential code is similar to what it was before, but the clarification makes it very clear that exterior wall projections are not allowed from exterior walls if they are less than 2 feet from a property line. This is significant because it confirms that eave extensions are not permitted within 2 feet of a property line, regardless of whether the underside is protected with 1-hour construction or even if the building is sprinklered. This is pretty common when we have accessory buildings, whether it's a detached pool room, a detached garage, some type of building that is very customarily associated with a main dwelling, so therefore it would be regulated here in California under the CRC. Note that as shown in this diagram, no projections are allowed when that fire separation distance is 2 feet or less. There are a lot of jurisdictions that have basically regulated eave projections from the perspective of whether or not they're causing cross-lot drainage or other stormwater to cross beyond the property line. And some jurisdictions felt that as long as you put a rain gutter on the bottom, it could be very, very close to a property line. In some instances, they would require the underside to be protected by 1-hour construction. That actually is not the case. The CRC now clearly makes it known that if it is within 2 feet of the property line, that projection is not permitted. A new requirement has been added to the California Residential Code, which now requires either a 1/2 inch layer of gypsum board or a 5/8 inch thick layer of structural wood panel sheathing on the underside of floors when that underside is exposed to an area which could be used for storage or placement of a fuel burning appliance. R302.13 provides this requirement, and basically what it does is if there is an area, whether it is a basement or a partial basement, if it is an area that could be used to store material or place a furnace or some other type of equipment that has a fuel burning aspect to it, either a 1/2 inch layer of gypsum board or that 5/8 inch structural wood panel sheathing does need to be provided. And the intent there is to provide a little bit of time, a little bit of protection, so that if a fire does develop within that space, the occupants of that building have a little bit more time to get out. This is a nice change to the code. Residential Code Section 310.2.5 has been changed in the model code, and basically what it does is it makes it a little bit easier to change out existing windows when those windows are used for emergency escape and rescue. Sections R310.1, R310.2.1, and 310.2.2 are the pertinent sections. And basically what we see is that the minimum opening size, the minimum dimensions, both in terms of height and minimum width, and the window sill height don't need to comply with those minimum provisions, provided the minimum replacement window is the manufacturer's largest standard size window that is available that will fit within the existing frame or existing rough opening. The replacement window is of the same operating style as the existing window, or a style that provides for an equal or greater window opening area than the existing window. The replacement window also cannot be part of a change of occupancy. So what we see here is, in the past, we've encountered these problems where somebody has an existing building and they wanted to change out a window which might be a required emergency escape or rescue opening for a sleeping room. They wanted to go to a more energy efficient window or something of that nature. Their intent was to improve their dwelling, but the existing window didn't even meet our current emergency escape and rescue openings. That's always been problematic for our jurisdictions, and in many instances the applicant indicated that they're willing to put a window that meets the current opening size or even better than what's already there. So they were taking an existing situation and they certainly were not making it any worse. So what this provision of the code does is it will actually allow that by right, as long as the window that is being proposed is the manufacturer's largest size that will fit within that space, and as long as they're not changing a type of window from either a slider to a casement or something else that's going to adversely affect the net opening, and as long as it's not a change of occupancy. So this will make things easier for most jurisdictions. Last couple things I want to talk about, electrical vehicle charging, section R309.8, newly constructed 1 and 2 family dwellings and townhouses with attached private garages shall comply with the EV infrastructure requirements in accordance with Cal Green, Chapter 4, Division 4.1. So what does this mean? Shall comply with EV infrastructure requirements. What this means is if there is a newly constructed 1 or 2 family dwelling or a townhouse, if it has an attached private garage, it's required now that the infrastructure be provided that will facilitate conversion later on to allow the installation of electrical vehicle charging equipment. The EV charging equipment does not need to be installed now, but the infrastructure does. So, see Cal Green section 4.106.4.2.3 for the details regarding exactly what constitutes the infrastructure. And what you'll find is that there are some provisions in there which will give you some guidance on whether or not 208 or 240 volt services provided, what the raceway requirements are, requirements regarding the cabinet, requirements regarding at least 140 amp overcurrent protection device is. All those details are indeed located in Cal Green section 4.106.4.2.3. And to close out, I would like to remind everybody here in California that we do have requirements for mandatory water efficient landscape ordinances, and in Cal Green Chapter 4, Division 4.3, those standards have been referenced. They actually have already taken effect. The Muello requirements took effect December 1st of 2015, but they are now referenced in Cal Green, and basically what's required is if you have a residential development and there is an aggregate landscaped area equal to or greater than 500 square feet, either a local water efficient landscape ordinance must be in place that addresses those standards, or the state's WELO requirements, whichever is more stringent, have to apply to the irrigation system. Of course, the requirements might require, in certain instances, a moisture detection system, so it determines whether or not the area to be irrigated is already sufficiently wet, thereby defeating the triggering of rain sprinklers. There are some requirements so that if it's raining, the irrigation system automatically is disabled and so forth. But whether or not your jurisdiction has its own local water efficient landscape ordinance, or whether or not there's going to be reliance upon the WELO requirements, be aware of the fact that CalGreen Chapter 4, Division 4.3 does address that. And if you would like specific requirements, and for those jurisdictions that are still having a little bit of trouble applying the state mandated requirements, the website on the bottom of this slide will give you some information. And with that, I'd like to thank you for your time. Here's some contact information for you. If you do have some questions regarding these highlighted changes, you can contact me at this information. And as I indicated at the beginning of this presentation, there are some wonderful resources that have been developed, both the significant changes to the California Building Code, significant changes to the California Residential Code, and significant changes to the California Fire Code. Those documents have been developed by some of the really knowledgeable individuals here in the state, and they will be available for purchase in early fall. There will be a link at the end of this presentation for those of you that are interested. As those classes become available for those jurisdictions that need a slightly broader exposure to some of the significant changes in the code than these top 30 that I talked about, keep your eyes open. I'm sure there will be a class coming soon to your neighborhood. And with that, I'd like to thank you for your time.